So on the show today, Shawn Desjardins. So Shawn is joining us from Canada. He is the founder of Mindful Martial Arts, does some circus stuff and mechanical engineer in a past life. So Shawn, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
So we're just getting to know each other, and I think it was Georgia Very from Australia who connected us, and she did a very cool podcast on trauma-sensitive kickboxing. He said you should talk to Shawn. I was like, cool, why not? So welcome, sir.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
So how did you get interested in martial arts? What was your journey with this?
So, yeah, I guess it's a long story, but I'll start with I was a mechanical engineer going to university, and I was absolutely obsessed with watching fights, watching MMA, watching especially an organization called Pride in Japan, which used to put on these crazy events. Like, I mean, people would fight 4 times in a night against people of different weights and different skill sets. And it was almost like Street Fighter, in real life. So strange. But I was absolutely just kind of obsessed with it. And, I was sitting here in like a small apartment going to university, studying like formulas in a tiny room. And I guess I craved something that was as epic and as exciting as martial arts competition. So yeah, eventually I got into a bad relationship, and then when that ended, I was like, you know what? Why am I holding myself back from all the things that I want? And I just started going for the things that I really wanted in life, and that's when I started training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It was pretty much almost 10 years ago now.
It's interesting. A couple of things there. One is like these sensationalist events, easy to criticize, but it can really draw people in. And, the Japanese were great showmans with Pride, weren't they? And you'd have the, Hickson Gracie fighting someone twice his size or whatever. It was kind of fun. And, these days things are better regulated, and it's probably a lot safer these days, more rules, more gloves, more weight categories. Something like UFC these days, pretty respectable. But back in the day, it was certainly a lot of fun. And, I remember those first like style match offs in the early days of Pride and UFC and Strikeforce. It was like, wow, cool.
Yeah. It was really inspiring to see smaller people go in and take the challenge of fighting a larger person and really use skill and intelligence and resilience and just all these characteristics that they needed to draw upon to be victorious.
And you also mentioned a bad breakup, and it's interesting. I've heard this from a few people. They had some tough thing happen in their life. Maybe it was a death of a parent or a child sometimes, and a bad breakup or coming out of drug addiction or whatever it was. And they have this corner, and they go, what, I need something positive, and there's just something sort of wholesome about martial arts that can draw people in at that point.
Hmm. Yeah, there's community. There's like a deep sense of community that it's hard to explain. I guess you could kind of feel that in sports as well, but the intimacy of fighting other people, it's truly an intimate thing. You really have to put a lot of trust into the people around you.
Mm-hmm. There's a few factors, isn't there? On the one hand, there's this kind of framework of meaning making and ritual, which is missing in so many people's lives. Even if it's just bowing in. And then there's this idea of just physical intimacy. Like I've one time a good friend of mine from Aikido, we're sitting together on the beach and we're so comfortable with each other's bodies that a third person was there, and she actually thought we were lovers because we were just so comfortable with each other, and we were like, no way, but it was like there's a familiarity with other bodies and that intimacy of being engaged in this almost existential tussle that really brings people together.
Totally.
So you're right, it was Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. For people that don't know that, do you want to say a little bit about what that is? Because we might have like yoga people listening or dance people listening.
Yeah, so my first art is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu basically stemmed from Japanese judo. There was a man who traveled from the original kind of judo school to Brazil and started, actually he was going around the world fighting different people, boxers and wrestlers and whatever. And he ended up teaching the Gracie family, who one of the sons, Elio, I guess, one of the founders of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, he didn't have the physical strength to execute the techniques associated with judo. So yeah, he couldn't do a push-up, he couldn't do a pull-up, he couldn't really execute the throws with the intensity that was needed. So he started modifying the art so that somebody who was smaller and weaker could contend against a larger opponent. And truly, I think its basis is self-defense. Jiu-Jitsu, its core, I think, is about surviving first, you know? So yeah, it's a lot of grappling. It's a lot of arm locks, chokes, joint manipulation. The kind of like basic tenets of it are to protect yourself, avoid the striking range where the more powerful person can do as much damage as they possibly could to you, take the person to the ground, establish control, and then move towards a submission.
Great. So this is, I think it was the 90s. It started to get famous because they would have this kind of challenge matches, and that evolved into the UFC and things like that. And this idea of the smaller person beating the bigger person is a very martial arts idea, but often it's really a fantasy. But in this case, it really was the case that the people were taking on people twice their size, and it was demonstrable. You can see this old video footage. Guys would come into the club and challenge them, and then they just choke them out, tap them out, and then they try again. They say, I want to go again. And a lot of people suddenly realize that the image of the martial artist as the sort of kicking kung fu master was, actually not necessarily the most useful practical stuff.
Totally. Yeah. So yeah, that's where I started back in 2011. And I became simultaneously in love and obsessed.
Yes.
Yeah, it just... something about it grabbed me and didn't let me go, if you want to think of it in that way. And
maybe just jump on that a minute. Why does martial arts get people obsessive? Because I was an obsessive Aikido for some years, live-in student, 8 hours a day. I've seen it with Jiu-Jitsu. Jiu-Jitsu never quite hooked me, though I could see why it could. It's very technical. There's a lot to learn. They call it, chess kind of on the floor. There's something very physical in it, something very primal in our complicated modern world. Why do people get so obsessed with martial arts? Because, it's cool, but at the end of the day, unless you're a doorman or special forces or something, you're not really going to use the practical skills every day in Toronto or Brighton, right?
So I would say that, like, in my lifetime, when I was younger, I got into all kinds of things, not to really my own doing, just being kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time. Like people trying to jump me, or being at a party and a fight breaks out and I'm in the middle of it, or all kinds of crazy stuff, to be honest. And I never felt quite safe.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I grew up in a suburban neighborhood, but I was, for whatever reason, involved in a bunch of conflict. My first day, like my first week at high school, some guy chased me with a knife. I just had a bunch of adverse things happen when I was in my teens. And so I never quite felt like confident or safe. There was like this real sense of danger in the world. And jiu-jitsu gave me this, not only this like idea that I could defend myself, but the pragmatic reality that day in and day out, I was fighting people bigger than me usually. And as I progressed, it gave me this sense of confidence to defend my physical body that extended way beyond actually having to defend my physical body. It gave me a confidence that, I guess it's almost like, like Maslow's hierarchy. Like I was able to establish safety for myself. And from that, I was able to move into other things, and I was able to gain more sense of courage and more belief in myself. And yeah, that really like sustained me.
Yeah, it's interesting. On the one hand, we could say this need to look after yourself, to defend yourself, is so primal that if that's not taken care of, it undermines a lot of other stuff. So we, civilized modern man tends to think of himself as like, I didn't need to worry about survival. There's enough food on my, till COVID hit anyway, there's enough food on my plate. There's no real diseases around. There's no war. War is something maybe your great grandfather did. It's kind of like, we're not given that existential threat, but actually it's always there. Like literally I'm walking down the street, that guy could just attack me and kill me right there. And on some level, people know that, and it undermines all these other needs that rest upon that.
Totally. And like, I don't know if people give themselves credit for how many times in life they don't speak up because there's some feeling that they might get overtaken or dominated, or there's this like amorphous, background threat of what if it goes sour,
Yeah.
like, am I able to handle myself?
Yeah,
And
I mean, I told someone to fuck off the other day. I haven't done it in years, but like this guy was incredibly rude to me, and I just wasn't going to take it. And the people in the shop was just looking at me like, this is outrageous. I just said, just looked the guy in the eye and said, why don't you fuck off?
yeah,
And in that moment, I was utterly unscared if he would attack me or not. Now,
yeah,
I had no intention of doing him any physical harm. I haven't physically hurt anyone in many, many years, but I knew that he couldn't physically hurt me. I looked at him, I sized him up, I felt my body, and I went, no, this guy can't physically intimidate me in any way. I can say the exact thing that's in my mind, which at that moment was fuck off. Another day it might be, something else, right? That's much more vulnerable. But I didn't fear the physical consequence, so I was free to speak how I wanted to speak at that point.
super fair. Yeah, there's something about like having some force behind your no. Like fuck off to me is like a strong no. It's like, no, you're not going to come in here and act this way or treat us with disrespect or whatever the scenario is. So having some force behind that no is like, it gives it strength and it gives it power, and it makes it effective. And having a strong no is so important in life, I think.
And one thing I was thinking about here is if you don't have your own no, you're sort of relying upon the state.
Yes.
Like the state has a monopoly on violence, except for martial artists, right?
Yeah.
Like legally it has a monopoly on violence, right? We have the right to self-defense. That's about it. But what that means is that you're essentially in this childlike position in regard to the state if you can't defend yourself.
That's brilliant. I 100% agree with that. It's like, oh, well, the laws will protect me. It's like, usually that's true.
But also the guy's not, the police are a long way away.
Yeah.
And some part of me feels like, if I only have to use martial arts physically, like once in my life, but if that one time stops my wife being raped,
yeah,
that was worth those thousands of hours, right?
Yeah.
Like if you know what I mean, like, well, that one time stops you getting killed. So I go, this the physical, but maybe more interesting to those of us who live in pretty safe places is how it affects the psychological.
Totally. Like I was gonna say, like hopefully we never have to use that stuff. And to be honest, like the more that I trained, the more I found myself going into other people's conflicts and trying to be helpful because I wasn't scared anymore. So we get into a fight, I'd come in, I'd be like, don't worry, it's all good, grab somebody very calmly. It's okay, don't worry, man. Like,
yeah, you develop not just to defend yourself, but the ability to be more altruistic.
Totally.
Like, hey, how can I help? Are you guys okay? It seems like you're arguing. Is everything cool? The one I've always found to never advise getting anyone in the middle of is a couple who are having an argument, because that always ends badly if you become the third person.
I actually did that a couple of years ago. I was staying at a friend's apartment and I heard some screaming, like bloody murder in the hallway, and I didn't even think it was like an impulse. I just immediately went outside and this guy's like berating his wife, and the wife is sitting there scared with a kid, and just like, he's got that look in his eyes, that kind of like rage that is kind of blind. So anyways, I asked him in a really intense way if he was okay, just to get his attention. And then all that rage went right, and then his domination, his anger, his rage came straight into my eyes. And I wasn't afraid. I was super activated, but I wasn't afraid. So I kept on asking him, like, are you okay? And then when he saw that I wasn't going to cave to his energy or to his anger, it almost like he had nothing to reflect it back to him. His wife was submitting because she was afraid.
Right. Submitting creates more dominance, but not submitting doesn't if there's no aggression. Right?
Neutral.
We do this exercise in my training where someone screams abuse in someone's face. This is all done with consent and calibration. The Paul Linden principle is one of my main teachers. And if you just sit there loving them, they can't keep shouting at you. Like, I've not seen anyone keep it up for more than 30 seconds. I'm like, shout at me for as long as you can. And 10 seconds in, most people stop. They just can't keep hating you if you're not dominating or not submitting.
100%. It's that presence, right? And with that presence, it's like, there's like a mirror, or like maybe if you're able to be in the state where you're even showing compassion for them, it's even stronger. But
Tell me about mindful martial arts then. Like, how did you get, like, what was the twist? I mean, if you were just another jiu-jitsu guy, you kind of wouldn't be on the show, right? So, like, you know, like what happened there?
So basically, I started training in 2011. I fell in love, but throughout the entire time I was training, I had such intense adverse reactions to training simultaneously. Like it was all the time. I'd be having panic attacks. I'd be having, I'd be running to the washroom, almost throwing up. I would be, yeah, just like I had an adverse reaction at times to just being in an activated state in my body. And I also had a ton of mental health challenges that were surfacing during that time. And I didn't really understand them. But I kept on having to make the really difficult choice between, do I keep training this art, which is bringing me so much, but at the same time, it's actually taking away from me a lot. Like I'm living, I guess, from a trauma lens in a triggered state all the time. And so I worked out that,
Can we dig into that a little bit, Shawn? Sorry, I interrupting, not just to be rude, but because I really like, this is such a good point that so many people are in martial arts and they're simultaneously loving it and being empowered. But
yes.
at the same time, maybe they're being activated. They're like in fight, flight. Their stuff is surfacing, you know, like they get grabbed and it reminds them of a sexual assault, or like they feel disempowered. There's often this it reminds me almost of an abusive relationship. You know what I mean? Like there's this love and simultaneously there's this like you feel like shit and there's rigid hierarchies and like that's like, let's speak to that a little more because
oh my God,
like
yeah.
That's so much people's experience in martial arts.
Yeah, like I guess on the trauma front, like there's so much trauma bonding. There's so much re-traumatization that happens.
What trauma bonding is, because people might not know. That's so useful, the concept.
I guess, yeah. In my basic understanding, it's like almost like an automatic attachment that's formed through abusive or adverse interactions between people.
Stockholm syndrome, right? Where people end
Stockholm syndrome, yeah. It's like it's a survival mechanism. Like imagine a wolf pack, and then the two wolves are fighting for the alpha position. One of them wins, the other one becomes submissive. The submissive one has to attach to the dominant one, to the alpha, for survival because they work in a pack, they work in a group. So it's not like, oh, I lost, I'm going to go somewhere else and start my own family where I'm out. No, it's like you have to submit and become, well, I guess in one example.
And it's an intense situation, like something traumatizing can still make people feel very alive, even if it's very unpleasant. So there's going to be that ambiguous relationship to it. Yeah. So trauma bonding can happen, which is a fucked up phenomenon. It's why people stay with abusive partners and look back fondly on World War II or whatever it is. What was the next concept you said? You said
re-traumatization in the sense of like, okay, so I guess we'll get into the nitty gritty a little bit. So I really like the concept of the window of tolerance. It's like, in the simplest way I've heard it put, this range of human experience where you can think and feel simultaneously.
Yeah, so you can handle this to a degree.
You can process your experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
For example, if you're so terrified, you go into a freeze or a panic, and you cannot process or think about what's happening, you're not getting adaptive information into your being in order to figure out, okay, oh, this person reminds me of this person who attacked me when I was younger, and that's why I'm afraid. And oh, actually, they're not attacking me. There's, like having.
So we can stress people out as long as it's within the window of tolerance. They have a sense of control, and they're able to process it. So I first came across this phenomenon in Aikido. I'd see some Aikido people that would get stiffer and stiffer and stiffer over the years. Yeah. And what was happening, as I later understood when I understood trauma, was that the initial like grab or strike or whatever they were practicing with was too much. Yeah. So I actually just put them more in fight or flight. And then when the next one happened, too much again. And micro, over the years, they were becoming harder and more wooden. Whereas other people were getting more and more relaxed.
Yes.
And those were the people that were within their window of tolerance when they were training, and they just were able to squeeze it. So the sort of intelligent martial arts teacher sees where the window is and keeps people within that window, right?
100%. That's exactly the principles behind mindful martial arts. So I guess to go back to my personal story, like you were saying, like, you know, there's so many of these people that have this kind of like relationship that's yeah, it's like what's the word? There's like there's poles to it, you know? There's this love and there's this
Yeah.
they're getting so much from the self-defense and the martial arts, but at the same time, you know, they're being triggered, they're being put into situations where they don't quite feel like they have control of themselves, or
Yes.
their sense of agency and choice is sometimes taken away.
It could be, martial arts could be profoundly disempowering in the sense of like there's this hierarchy and you have to be told what to do. And if sensei says 20 push-ups, you do 20 push-ups, even if you know that that's past your safe limit, right? Like that could be profoundly disempowering.
100%. And especially when the teacher, the sensei, is not attuned to your being.
Let's just be blunt. The average martial arts teacher, particularly in my experience, Japanese martial arts teachers, but maybe more widely, is shit at this. Some of them are like naturals, they're intuitive, but 9 out of 10 of them are terrible at this.
There's an epidemic of traumatized martial arts teachers, you know, who they found their sense of empowerment through becoming really, really good at this skill, but it doesn't mean that they dealt with their core issues, which made them probably originally, like me, go directly into wanting to be such a badass and, you know, defend myself and be this epic fighter.
You know, there's a book which has the biographies of the founders of Aikido, Judo, and modern karate.
Mm,
And in this book, all three of them were described as sickly children.
yeah,
And all three of them saw their dads get beaten up.
yeah.
And I went, that is not an accident that the three founders of the modern, three of the most popular modern martial arts all had this sort of disempowered, sickly beginning where they felt powerless. But as you say, then it's like the issues aren't really getting dealt with. It's like an insecurity that's constantly covered over by having another black belt or another flashy move, and it's still there, right? That insecurity is still there for so many martial artists.
Totally. And yeah, I feel like that story is like the story of martial arts mastery, you know, like you come from a place where you're very disempowered and you climb up and you find a way to empower yourselves, but the path there has, I think, traditionally been kind of messy. That's an understatement, but you know, the way that the tools that martial arts instructors have to understand themselves and to understand the process of empowerment, I think, is very like caveman-esque.
Mm-hmm.
And it is shrouded in like what you're saying, these kind of like traditional hierarchies of dominance. And um, you know, I've been thinking more about this stuff recently with regards to like hierarchies and things, and there's reasons for them, you know, like hierarchies I don't think are inherently bad, but
Sure.
I do believe that there's responsibilities associated with hierarchies that people don't always take into account. Like if you're a 250-pound black belt with 20 years of experience, you have a responsibility towards that, you know, 120-pound woman who's a beginner. You can't like, it's common sense. You're not going to crush that person, right? But there's some nuance and some subtlety within that I feel like my experience can help inform others how to navigate martial arts training in a way where it becomes win-win scenarios as much as possible.
It's amazing that martial arts are by dealing with trauma or existential issues, threat, safety, and yet haven't taken on this work. I mean, Paul Linden was the first one I saw. Then I came across Georgina Ferry. She mentioned you, one or two other people. But we're really looking at 4 or 5 martial arts clubs in the world.
I know.
Like literally, I'm trying to bring you guys together, saying, hey, you guys should chat. You should chat to Stephen Kotev, who's a jiu-jitsu friend of mine that studied with Paul Linden. I'll hook you two up. You'd have a great chat. But it's he's in DC. But there's really only 4 or 5 clubs in the world.
Yeah.
Right? A couple of jiu-jitsu, a couple of aikido, one kickboxing, and that I've ever heard of. And this is strange. And I go, maybe it's time for an update here. Maybe it's time we brought this Western knowledge into the Eastern knowledge. And you say looked at things like hierarchy and windows of tolerance and training schedules and consent, another big one, right? That's just horribly walked over in most dojos.
Oh my God.
Right.
Yeah.
Consent, forget about it. I mean, I hear some of my old teachers retelling stories and I'm just like, that's an abuse story.
Yeah.
That's literally all it is. You're telling me it's like, oh, then Judo Sensei broke my arm, and I'm like, that's abuse.
That's not good. That's not a good thing.
Right? Like, don't wear those scars with pride. Like, I think we can do better.
I 100% agree. And, like the way that mindful martial arts came to be was because as I kept training and I kept on encountering the challenges, exactly what you're saying, like I probably trained at 20 gyms in my life. I used to travel a lot when I was younger. I would go to different countries and be working in Central America and just try everything. There's varying degrees of like humanity that I found in martial arts, and too often I experienced kind of like what you're saying. Like I started to acknowledge during my martial arts journey that I was healing from childhood trauma.
Yeah.
I didn't know that before I was 27 years old. I had no memories. I had no idea. I just started to have things surface in my 27th year that were, oh yeah, okay, like I went through severe trauma when I was a kid. And as that surfaced for me, I was looking for an environment where on a day where I spent the entire day triggered and I was outside my window of tolerance, I could come in and still be around people and train in a way that was beneficial to me. I almost never found it. I would go into the gym, I'd be like, hey, I'm not really feeling it today. Like I still want to work technique, but like I can't, roll 100%. Yeah. Some guy come at me full force, trying to choke me.
Right.
One time the instructor called me a pussy in front of my face.
Wow.
I swear to God, he called me a pussy. And then a couple days later when I was feeling better, I went and choked him out, and then he started respecting me. It's like, it's only the domination that was respected. It's like, if you can't beat me up, I'm not going to give you respect.
Yeah.
Look,
sure.
I may be able to beat you up, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here to learn. I'm here to grow. I'm here to get better. If every training session is a fight to the death, no one's going to make it out of here, Like everyone's going to be injured and no one's really going to learn effectively or efficiently. So.
This is almost quite sad, isn't it? There's this healing urge that could happen in a dojo and sometimes does, but it's so badly structured and comes with all this potential nonsense that it's a real missed opportunity, I think, a lot of the time. And then, I also want to acknowledge there are some teachers out there who are just really good eggs, just decent human beings. And they go, oh, my teacher would have broken your arm, but I'm not going to, and they've somehow, they've sort of just intuited some of this stuff about windows of tolerance. And I mean, did you get like a trauma education and then you read some books from Peter Levine, or like, how did you bring this in?
It was like, I want to say 5-6 years of intensive trauma therapy that continues to this day. Sensory motor psychotherapy was something that informed me about like the animal self-defense mechanisms and the window of tolerance and attachment theory. And the more that I learned and the more that I went through my healing process, the more that I am going through my healing process, the more I'm like seeing the martial arts, seeing the whole world in a different light, but really seeing the martial arts dojo in a different light and being like, yeah, where is this coming from? Is this person insecure and they're trying to, like, it's so...
Yeah. It's a head fuck when you start realizing this, right? Like, I remember when I did martial arts long before I was doing psychology at the same time, but I didn't really have any trauma psychology training until I was like maybe 8-10 years in martial arts. And then it changes your lens, right? You're like, oh, that guy's insecure. Oh, that guy's doesn't feel safe. That's where all this is coming from. Or, like, oh, that I feel secure in this dominance hierarchy because it's so clear. It's so clear. It's like, it's not dangerous when you know exactly what to do and where to line up, and you know that you're the fifth in the lineup because you're the blue belt and he's the brown belt. There's I think, and it suddenly made sense of why these structures were there and how they were being used and misused.
It's very interesting.
So what are some of the things you've innovated or added then here? Like, what is a trauma-sensitive jiu-jitsu dojo? What does that even look like?
So for me, like one thing that I'm really trying to bring back in is a value system. Like I practice mixed martial arts, and mixed martial arts doesn't have that traditional history of bowing in and, here are the rules of engagement. It's kind of a little Wild West out there. So bringing in a value system, simply enough, like, respect yourself, respect your training partners. And if you don't know what that means, talk about it. If you don't understand how to respect yourself or your training partner, or you feel like there's a conflict there, have a conversation. Don't just keep beating the shit out of each other, you know? Like, take a step back and be like, look, I'm not able to get into the flow of this training. Like, maybe I'm being maybe you have 50 pounds on me and you're just crushing me. And I want to actually benefit from this too. So is there any way you could, like, you know, reduce your intensity and we could work together? Something like that, you know?
Yeah. You know, part of me goes, oh, I really want to go back to Jiu-Jitsu or MMA, which I did for a little while. I did a year of it just to kind of get a bit real. And part of me goes, God, I don't want to expose myself to low-level abuse and low-level trauma. I just can't be bothered. And a certain amount of that I can kind of take out by, you know, for example, I'll stop people in sparring and saying, hey, you're a bit good for me. If you just knock me unconscious, it's not going to help. Yeah. Can we tone it down a bit? I've got no pride in saying that. I don't mind that. I don't feel like I lose something in saying that now. I feel like I'm being more of a man. I'm being more fucking looking after myself by saying,
you're respecting yourself.
Yeah, for me, that's like just looking after myself. I've been an idiot not to do that.
Yeah.
But even then, if the culture's not there in the club, it doesn't always go down well, you know?
You're 100% correct. That's when you get called a pussy and somebody tries to beat you up anyway.
It's so primitive. It's like, what is this, high school? They're calling me a pussy? You know what I mean? It's so primitive.
But yeah, so like on that note, it's exactly that. It's like creating a context which is respectful for everyone, because the idea is that everyone should be able to walk in and start to gain confidence and grow in a sustainable way. It's not about, okay, some guy comes in, he's really, really strong. He's just going to crush everyone and rise to the top of the dominance hierarchy. And he's going to be like king shit, you know, like that's not what I'm trying to do. Yeah.
Okay. So what else does it look like? Like, what does consent look like? Cause that's normally done so badly. What does that look like in a enlightened MMA studio?
Basically, I encourage people to ask for their needs and to say no.
Okay, great.
You're not comfortable with something, like I don't say, oh, you're allowed to. I say I encourage you to say no. If something doesn't feel right, it feels dangerous, you're not comfortable with it, say no, let's have a conversation about it. Because, you know, I want people coming into martial arts with a fuck yes. Not with like, oh, this is what my teacher said and I have to for what? Like, nobody has to fight. Like, you're doing this for you. You're not doing it for me or for, like, you know, anyone else in the world. It's for yourself or for whatever your personal reasons are. Maybe it's for your family or et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, like, I really encourage people to ask for their needs. And if they're reasonable, I'll try to meet them, or we'll try to meet them, you know?
That's nice.
That goes on.
Basic skills, asking for what you want, saying no, right? These are like, you know, it's interesting. They're the two basic time management skills as well. People tell me they're overwhelmed. I'm like, well, are you delegating? You know, are you saying no to stuff? Like right now, running the embodiment conference, huge event I'm running. They're the two main skills. You know, yes. like every day, it's like saying no, I'm too busy for that, and like being able to say like, hey, honey, can you cook me some food? I don't normally ask you to cook, but I just don't have time. You're willing to leave me some food out? You know, like that kind of stuff is so important.
Amazing.
Are you signed up for the conference, by the way, Shawn? Have we got you involved in that yet?
You know what? I think I saw an ad for it a while back, and I'm pretty sure I did sign up now that I think about it.
No, but as a speaker, if you want to come on and speak, send me your email immediately after this. Just message me it, and I'll put it in the chat now, and I'll see if I can hook you up. We're a little bit short of American slots, but you know, there's Tom in charge of the martial arts, so
that'd be amazing.
Yeah. So my speakers, it's funny that the adverts are all over the world. And I had a friend in Russia who sent me an advert, and I was like, she said, I saw your advert on Facebook. It's kind of fun. Okay, so here's another. Tell me what you think of this. I did this the other way around in Russia the other day. So I wanted to give people an experience of martial arts who weren't martial artists. So we did a session with Bokken, which is like Aikido wooden swords, and I was really like the strict, firm Japanese style teacher. But they still had consent, but without the abuse, you know? And it was almost like the other way around. It was, rather than taking martial arts and making it trauma sensitive, it was like, what would that look like to give to people who weren't going to do jiu-jitsu and get choked out? Because, you know, the average Muscovite life coach, you know, elegant young woman, she's not gonna do sweaty ass jiu-jitsu. There's just no way. So it's like, I wonder if we can also get some of these benefits from martial arts to people who aren't going to have that experience. They're just not going to do what you and I have done.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, like, I really am a proponent that it has to be real, because, like, you know, there's a lot of traditional martial arts that I really believe that there's a real grounded sense of confidence that you get when you test what you're doing and you bring resistance into play. And,
Yes.
you know, like, it's like, for me, for example, before I started sparring in boxing or kickboxing, and I'd be on the bag and I'd be, man, I was Muhammad Ali. I was so good. I was so powerful. I was so amazing. But, you know, when somebody hits you back, you're like, okay, well, that's different. And what can I actually do? You know, like, what's my actual capacity? And I think that in one sense, like, jiu-jitsu is amazing for that, because you can test your capacity with relative, like, high intensity pretty safely. You have to be a lot more careful when it comes to striking and kickboxing, boxing, etc., to make sure you preserve your health in that process. But I mean, yeah, I really, really do feel that you know, if somebody were to experience some kind of a physical confrontation, like, you need to know what your actual capacity is. It can't be theoretical. It can't be something that was practiced on, like, you know, inanimate objects. I think there has to be that sense of, like, all right, like, if let's say I'm a 120-pound woman, I need to know what I can actually handle. Because if, you know, I have this thought in my head, oh, I kicked this bag a bunch, and then 100, 200.
Yeah. So this is the danger of fantasy. So most Aikido people fall into this realm that they're really living. My friend Rokas has got this great channel where he went on an MMA journey from a Lithuanian guy. You might have seen him on YouTube.
Oh, I have, yeah.
Nice guy, really humble. And, you know, he was in Aikido for a long time. And then he said, you know what, how do I make this more practical? And he tried that. And eventually he moved over to MMA. Interestingly, he's now moving into more like psychology, because he's realizing that's where it's really at. But, you know, he got a lot of shit from people because there's a lot of people very invested in fantasy. And the same, when I took a year out of Aikido to do a year of MMA, I was like, well, I want to find out what really works. And the answer was almost none of it, right?
Yeah.
Like, it was kind of depressing. And I was like, you know, that 1 year of jiu-jitsu, regular jiu-jitsu training, is probably more useful for me than 20 years of Aikido practically. And the same for Wing Chun, ninjutsu, like so many arts. And everyone's like, no, not my teacher, not my style. But, you know, everyone else in Aikido, everyone else in Wing Chun, shut the fuck up. Like, really, like, go to the MMA dojo. Fucking really, but that fantasy is so dangerous. And then another version of this I've seen is the sort of modern Hollywood feminist fantasy of the young woman who just effortlessly beats people up. And I'm like, no. I used to date a female UFC star. So I know it's possible for a petite woman to choke out a large man. Yes, that is possible. However, size matters as well. Like, much as what we talked about with the Gracies earlier, like, the average woman the average male face is designed to be punched. That's what happens in puberty. You grow bone on your face so it can be punched as a man. If you haven't had that testosterone infusion, you definitely don't want your face punched by someone who has. Like, this is like just nonsense and fantasy that's being propagated right now, that in almost every Hollywood movie, when you see these petite little girls beating men up, it's like, that shit ain't gonna happen. I'm sorry. It's dangerous. I know I'm upset, you know, Canada's a pretty politically correct place, but let's get real, because reality is always the kindest thing.
Interesting. Yeah, it's a tricky thing, right? Because there is definitely differences, like, between the physicality of men and women, on a, you know, just in general, through biology. So yeah, that's like a whole nother topic, like, when it comes to, like, training men and women together, which is, you know, it's common now. Every jiu-jitsu gym, men and women train together. But I think that it's something that should be taken into account, you know? It's like, in general, the way that I like to see training is, like, the person who has greater size, power, experience, like, the person with less of those things gets to kind of dictate the pace, and you
Right. That's nice.
you as the more experienced person, like you meet them where they're at, and you find a way to work within that range. And yeah, like you said, like it's important that people have a real understanding of reality. Like just to play devil's advocate for shits, Shevchenko, the UFC, I think she's 135. She came into an MMA gym here in Toronto before a fight, and they had some 145 males who like they wanted to line them up for her to kind of practice on before.
Yeah.
And, they're amateur fighters. They're not professional fighters. So they're, if you would have took a 145-pound professional fighter, I'm sure it's a completely different story. But even these guys, 145 pounds, they were like, I don't want anything to do with that,
Yeah, it's just to date a UFC fighter. I've been choked out. She used to flip me in bed sometimes just for fun, But it was seriously emasculating. But it was, it is possible that skill can have a factor and attitude and all the rest of it. But I just feel like a really unrealistic picture is being given by Hollywood right now, and that is dangerous.
Yeah. I guess I don't know the Hollywood kind of whatever it is being portrayed, but I just think that, I mean, the more that you test yourself, the more you find out what your capacity is, and if you can do it safely, I think you can build a really strong, embodied, grounded, integrated sense of confidence. That's kind of my
Great. Anything else you'd add on, like, if there's people out there who are martial arts teachers, or maybe their kids go to a martial arts class and they want to pass this on to their kids' jiu-jitsu teacher or whatever, like anything else, what would be your advice for bringing some of this trauma sensitivity into a class?
Well, I think it kind of goes back to what you were saying around, like, what about these people who they're not going to get all sweaty and do jiu-jitsu, whatever else? Like, the foundations of martial arts are self-defense. So start there, start with like, okay, I want to learn how to defend myself better. Situational awareness, using your voice, like I work with some people who, through their own traumas, like their ability to say no was taken away from them. So
yeah.
I mimic a scenario where I'm an attacker and I come up with this aggressive energy, the voice doesn't even come out. It's not even there yet. So being able to even model scenarios where they can start to access their voice and bring their posture, like instead of getting into submissive posture, just like start where they can actually move forward and go as far back as you need to go so that they can actually gain traction. So that may literally being saying no. That may be like just showing them some simple moves of how to protect yourself, or
here's one that happened to me today, Shawn, that made me think. So I knew I was doing this interview. Literally, I was just walking around the park before I came here on a phone call, and I'm walking home, and there's a teenage girl walking in front of me, and I turn the corner, she turns the corner. So she's in front of me, she turns the corner, I turn the same corner. So there's two corners now, and I'm going. As a guy, you've got that thing of like, oh shit, I don't want her to think I'm the creepy guy, right? And I'm trying to get home to this interview. Like I can't go the long way around, I'm 2 minutes to go. I'm like shit, and then she goes into my house. So I live in a block of flats, and I didn't recognize her, but it turns out she lives in the same flats, right? Okay. And I'm following up the stairs behind her to go into the house. Now, at this point, her breathing was gone. I could see it from behind. Her posture was kind of shrunken. Like, no one's taught her to turn around and say, oh, hello, do you live here too? Right? Because I actually got out my key and said, I live here, and I put it in the lock to say, look, I do live here. Trying to reassure her that I wasn't some creepy guy. But had I just been following her into that flat, she just opened the door.
Yeah.
And now we're in a dark hallway, right?
Yeah.
And no one had taught her that basic confidence to turn around and say, oh, hello, do you also live at number 18? Because if not, I can't let you in.
It's very smart.
That would have been a disastrous situation for her had I been a malintended person, following her down the street. And she had no confidence to say that. You know what I mean? Like, that's the important skill, not the jiu-jitsu.
Yeah. I think they're both important, but I think that's primary.
You're right. It's first. Because she's not going to need to use the jiu-jitsu if she says you can't come in and it's in a street with people around rather than in a dark corridor, right?
Exactly. Yeah. That situational awareness and using her voice and Yeah, it's a very, very good point. A lot of like 99.9% of self-defense happens with, before any physical confrontation. So
Talk about the other side of it. This is just something I'm personally curious about. Like, as someone who's trained in martial arts and has been in dangerous places and just well educated and, feminist family, it's like I'm aware how I will be even perceived as creepy and dangerous.
what do you mean? Like
in this situation, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm utterly innocent in this situation. I'm literally just trying to get back to this appointment. But
Yeah.
as a man, I'm aware of this situation could be perceived as not good.
Totally.
Like, now that's the less important side of it. The more important side of it is, how do we, protect ourselves? How do we make sure people are safe? But that's another interesting side of it, isn't there? That once you're aware of the possibilities for violence, it's like, how can I put this? There's this uncomfortable position. Like, some of my friends who aren't trauma psychologists probably wouldn't have been aware that young lady was uncomfortable even, for example.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's like, how is it when you're trying to articulate something that's unarticulated here? Because it's not really that important a conversation. It's just like that, those awkward moments you get in as a guy. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think, like, on that note, like, one, like, you can make efforts to try to make people feel safer, but you can't rescue them from their, like, neurobiology. So if they're going to have a reaction, they're going to have a reaction. In some sense, like, if I think about it in the long term, like, imagine a scenario where somebody feels that you're walking behind them, and then let's say you pass them and you go your own way, and then inside they have this experience where they were afraid, and then okay, that wasn't a threat, and maybe that's like slowly adaptive over time. It would be really difficult to go around and try to make everyone feel safe.
Right. How much responsibility do I want to take there? Like, in this case, there was a simple thing I could do, which was to get my key and say, look, I actually live here, don't stress,
Which is nice of you.
Yeah, that was just me trying to be nice to the poor girl. But it was like, there are also other situations where I go, listen, other than crossing the street, what do you want me to do here? Like, at the end of the day, this is also your responsibility here.
Yeah. It's a tricky line to toe.
How Canadian do we want to get,
Well, yeah, honestly, like, I'm not a huge fan of how far we go here in Canada.
Can you speak to that? Because Canada is actually our third biggest audience for the podcast, and I'm always taking the piss out. And I've never had a bad experience with a Canadian, if I'm honest. We have Canadian team members. Some of my best friends are Canadian. So, and ice hockey, but Canadians have these two sides, right? Like, there's the nice, polite Canadian, and I also am a student of military history. And you guys are absolutely fucking mental when you go to war. Like, Canadians are like the people you want on your team when you're at war. Right, so it's like in war and ice hockey, you're complete berserkers. And in the rest of the time, you're super polite and everyone leaves their door open, apparently. Like, what's going on in Canada with violence and all this kind of stuff?
Honestly, like, I don't think there's a ton of violence here. Like, I used to live in Atlanta, Georgia, and if you look at the stats, it's like, it's gun violence and, yeah, violent crime is way, way, way higher. So I do think we live in a relatively safe society in general. I think that maybe what that does in some sense is it, like, gives people, like, people aren't used to confrontation, I guess. And so because of it, we have this, like, super adverse reaction towards confrontation. We avoid it kind of, like, societally. And sometimes I think that can make us kind of shitty. It can make us like maybe passive aggressive or like
aggressive.
Yeah. Because we don't know how to, like, when somebody, like, steps on your toe, we don't feel comfortable being like, what the fuck?
We're too apologetic.
Sorry. What do you mean sorry? Like, it's probably an accident and you can forgive it, but, like, don't be afraid to speak up when you're upset. I think we don't do a good job of speaking up when we're upset here.
Yeah, to actually say, hey, you've crossed the line, this isn't really good enough. And, a student of mine does courses for women who are too nice. And one of the things she says is, nice is just violence in disguise. Nice isn't kindness. To be too nice is just another way of doing violence, building up shitty passive aggression and resentments and undermining people. And, it just comes out sideways.
Totally. Yeah, that's in maybe a little contrast to the United States. Like, I think of, like, my image of, like, a New Yorker or somebody from New Jersey.
Yeah. My friend Joseph Riggio, he's still on his toe, you'd fucking know it. Well, I'm probably coming to Toronto to do some Systema next year. So let's stay in touch. Ping me a message on Facebook, Shawn. I've sent you a website here to Tom, who's in charge of martial arts at the conference.
Amazing.
Where do people find you online then? They go to mindfulmartialarts.org, right?
.ca. So I recently lost my space because of COVID. So the rental space got 4 times the rental cost. So I'm looking for a new space. Actually, just after this podcast, I'm going to go find a new space. But it's www.mindfulmartialarts.ca.
.ca, great. So mindfulmartialarts.org is a whole different group of people, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what that is, but
okay. Yeah, I just found it online, so I thought that was you originally, but it looks like someone else, judo people by the looks of things. Okay, yeah. Cool. So mindfulmartialarts.ca, and anything else people should be looking up? Any resources you want to shout out to people?
So yeah, I mean, add me on Facebook, Shawn Desjardins, like the bank in Canada, if you don't know how to spell it.
Mr. Gardens, right?
Of the Gardens, yes.
Cool.
What else? I think that like if you can get tapped into any kind of like trauma resources or like any books associated with trauma, window of tolerance, sensory motor, somatic experiencing, you know, coming from the martial arts side, if you're interested in trauma, I think that would be great. And then if you're coming from the trauma side, I think that martial arts in the right context is like fortifies something that is really important and hard to articulate sometimes.
Great. I want to point listeners to the episodes with Georgina Very from Australia, Paul Linden from Ohio, who's got lots of resources on martial arts and trauma, particularly Aikido, and Rosie Sexton, who we had on, who's she's done a lot of stuff in this area. So all 3 of those episodes would be related to this one. Okay, Shawn. So it was a pleasure. I really enjoyed this.
Thanks so much, man.
Yeah, I need to go, but this was fun, and keep in touch. Good to talk.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.